Welcome to North Grounds at the University of Virginia, home to the UVA Law School since 1974, along with the Darden Business School and the Judge Advocate General School. The North Grounds complex is one of UVA's newer architectural expansions and continues to grow today. But have you ever wondered what was here before the law school? What did this landscape look like? Who lived and labored here? Let's find out. Hi, I'm Randi Flaherty, Special Collections Librarian at the UVA Law Library. Join me today to explore the fascinating history of the North Grounds Woods, immediately behind the law school. UVA purchased this land for North Grounds in 1963. For 2 centuries before that, much of this space would have been cleared farm and pasture land, home to a series of farmers and communities of enslaved laborers, home to Albemarle County's first poorhouse, home to Confederate cavalry troops during the winter of 1863, home to the local Charlottesville barbecue grounds in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and beginning in the 1940s, the site for a new highway and eventually the construction of the academic grounds we know today. We begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of these lands and waters, the Monacan people, and by paying respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So we're entering the woods here on the Rivanna Trail. In 1999, the Rivanna Trail Foundation cleared a lot of these existing trails so that a lot of the stops where we're going to be today are actually accessible to hikers. And there's another trailhead up by the law school, at the back of the law school, at the parking lot. However, that's currently closed due to construction. So our story begins here. We're directly behind the JAG school, and we're going onto a property that was formerly known as Sunnyside, and we'll see that in a minute. And historically, this land sits between the 2 roads that go to Stanton and Whitehall for traffic in and out of Charlottesville. So we know that John Alphin purchased what would become the North Grounds land in 1788, and he operated here a hostelry and a horse track. And on this particular tract on the Sunnyside that we're going to be exploring today, the first permanent residence that we know of was actually a log cabin built by later members of the Alphin family when they lived here in the 1820s and 1830s, along with a community of at least 10 individuals whom they enslaved. So the trees and the brambles that you see today, at that time, really would have been open farmland. And there also would have been likely some outbuildings that would have facilitated farming and housed the community of enslaved workers. And it really wasn't until 1850 when there were significant renovations to that original log cabin, which became the house, which you can almost make out through the trees there, known as Sunnyside. Let's go take a look. So we're here now in front of the Sunnyside House. It's visible from the Rivanna Trail, but we're actually going to visit it today with permission from UVA Facilities Management. This is UVA property, and it's usually used for UVA faculty and staff housing. Let's go see the house. So we've now come up to the house. We're right next to Barracks Road. The first time we see the house referenced as Sunnyside is actually in an 1850s deed, and it was likely in reference to the Sunnyside home of author Washington Irving in New York, which was a well-known home at the time. Remodeling here in the 1850s turned that original log cabin into a Gothic revival cottage, and additions included adding the weatherboarding to the walls of the log cabin, building out the structure, and adding this porch. In 1858, a man named William Carroll purchased this property, and he actually operated the Sunnyside School here for a time. It was a private school for boys. The venture was short-lived, William Carroll did not find this a suitable place for a school, and his wife was irreconcilably opposed to living in this place. They moved out in 1862 during the Civil War. In 1863, Richard Thomas Walker Duke moved here with his family, his wife, his 3 children, and a community of enslaved people. That began the Duke family's 100-year ownership of the Sunnyside property. So we're here now at the side of the house, and like a lot of larger plantation homes, the front facade and the entrance driveway would have been on the opposite side of what would have been spaces for enslaved labor and life. And we know from Duke family records, from census records and other materials, we actually know the names of some of the people who were enslaved here on the property. Rose, Cy, Emily, Caesar Young, who was born in 1854 and actually after emancipation stayed on to work for the Duke family and live nearby. We know Jane, the enslaved cook, and we're going to talk more about her and about Caesar Young as we go along. We know that here on the property at this time, wheat was grown, hay, corn. We know there was a fruit orchard. We know there were pigs and fowl, all of which would have been grown and managed likely by enslaved individuals. And we can still see remnants of enslaved life here on the landscape at Sunnyside. Where we're standing now at the south end of the house, this once was space for a detached kitchen and also sleeping quarters for enslaved individuals. In 1894, the Duke family actually expanded out their house and connected those buildings to the house. They were later razed in 1958 during other house renovations. But one element that did remain with the house was the original fireplace for that detached kitchen, which remains part of the house, although it's now under a chimney which has been rebuilt. Other features here on the landscape, stone walls and stone ruins, are likely part of agricultural outbuildings from a later period, likely the 20th century. So just 50 feet off the back of the Sunnyside House, we get to what once was the grounds of the Albemarle County Poorhouse. So under Virginia law and under the supervision of the overseers of the poor, this 75-acre tract would have been home to people who were deemed unable to care for themselves for medical reasons, for financial reasons, and otherwise. And the poor laws were a regular topic covered by law professor John Minor to his UVA Law students during his tenure at UVA from 1845 to 1895. So what was here as part of the Poorhouse landscape? Well, we know from existing records, particularly a map, that closest to the Sunnyside House, there was an old burial ground, there was a field and a garden. As we approach and cross over this branch of the Meadow Creek, we get to what would have been really the heart of the Poorhouse grounds. This would have been the site of the Poorhouse cabins, of the kitchen, and of the superintendent's house. And these 5 cabins and the kitchen would have been aligned in 2 rows through this campus. And we know from drawings at the time that these likely would have been saddlebag cabins, which was a common style in this period. And that really means that these cabins would have had 2 separate rooms with a single shared chimney. There's not much evidence of these former residents here today. We see trees and brambles, the cabins are gone. But what we do have right here along the Rana Trail are the ruins of the Poorhouse superintendent's house. You can see it here. This once would have been a 2-story building, and you can see today the remains of the chimney and 2 fireplaces. So who would have lived here at the Poorhouse grounds? We know from census records and Poorhouse annual reports that women and children really made up the majority of the residents here. And at any given time, there were between 20 and 30 people living here. In 1860, for example, we know that Richard Anderson, who served as Poorhouse superintendent, would have lived here in the superintendent's house along with his wife and 3 children. We know from the census records in that year there were about 24 people also living at the Poorhouse, listed as paupers. That list included people like Patty Kidd, a 90-year-old white woman. It included Susan Moses, who was 35, and John Moses, age 4, her son. But also in this list of residents in the 1860s census are 2 enslaved people. They're unnamed in the census, but this list includes a 90-year-old woman whose owner had become insolvent, and an 80-year-old enslaved man who is likely here at the Poorhouse because he was blind. Poorhouse records indicate that residents were put to work if they were able, and those tasks would have included knitting, washing, working on the Poorhouse farm, likely cooking. And after the Civil War, we know that the Poorhouse continued to be residence for white and black inhabitants. One notable inhabitant was Louis Commodore, a man whose bondage was purchased for the University of Virginia in 1832 by law professor John A.G. Davis, along with 2 other UVA faculty members. He labored for the university up through the Civil War, so the longest tenure for an enslaved individual that we know of for the university. And his tasks, his jobs included ringing the rotunda bell every morning to wake up the residents of the academical village. After the Civil War, as a free man, Louis Commodore came to live here at the Albemarle Poorhouse. He suffered from abdominal ruptures, and actually he died in 1870, just as the Poorhouse had moved to its new location in Keswick across the county. So we're now moving westward along the Rivanna Trail, and we're getting to be almost directly behind the law school. During the winter of 1863 and 1864, this is during the Civil War, a Confederate cavalry unit under General Wickham wintered here in what was known then as the Poorhouse Woods, and they wintered through here all the way up to the barbecue site, which we're going to see next. And a member of the Duke family recalled in his memoirs meeting many of these soldiers and seeing their encampments, which would have been log cabins with stone chimneys, and those really would have dotted this whole landscape. They also built stables for their horses, and those were described as long sheds with roofs covered in leaves. Food and resources were very scarce in this time, and the soldiers actually paid the Poorhouse for their meals and also for wood for their fires. And we know this because these payments show up in Poorhouse accounting records from the time. Towards the end of the war, on March 3rd, 1865, the Union Army marched into Charlottesville. Richard Thomas Walker Duke Jr., who was just a boy at the time, remembers hearing their music here from Sunnyside. And he went and he ran up over the hills with Jane, with Caesar Young and some other enslaved individuals. And he ran over towards the university, and this group watched the Union troops march into Charlottesville. Jane, after seeing these Union troops arriving in Charlottesville, decided shortly thereafter to leave the Duke family, and she eventually became a cook for a family in New Jersey. So we're here about a half a mile from the Sunnyside House. As you can hear, we are directly below 250 and all the traffic out there. And we've come to what we think were the local Charlottesville barbecue grounds. We see, if you're ever on the Rivanna Trail and you walk through here, you might see some of these ruins here. This pit, we suspect, may have been a barbecue pit. And if you look through the woods there, you can see a little rock chimney, which we think may have been part of a stove for cooking Brunswick stew. The Dukes were a well-known family among Charlottesville's white elite, particularly after the Civil War. Richard Thomas Walker Duke Sr. practiced law, and both of his sons, Richard Thomas Walker Duke Jr. and William R. Duke, attended sessions at UVA Law under Professor John B. Minor. In the 1860s, Richard Thomas Walker Duke Sr. founded the Cool Spring Barbecue Club, and for decades the family hosted large southern barbecues in a spot that now sits directly behind the law school, just a half mile from the Sunnyside House. Groups invited to these Sunnyside barbecues included the Elks, Confederate veterans organizations, and UVA alumni groups, including UVA's chapter of the Zeta Psi fraternity. Newspaper clippings, recollections, and photographs provide detailed accounts of what these events would have been like. In this early photograph of the Cool Spring Barbecue Club, we see the blurred faces of the Duke family and their friends. We also see William and Robert Fortune on the left, and Mandy and Juba Carter, formerly enslaved by the Garth family, on the right. Caesar Young and another man named John Gilmore were likely also present. These men and women, among others, were famous here in Charlottesville for their culinary skills. Another photograph, taken about 60 years later in the 1930s, shows in clear detail the traditional Southern barbecue method. While the multi-course meal took place in the afternoon, the chefs would have been up since sunrise to prepare the barbecue pit. On long wooden poles they strung lambs, pigs, and sheep, which would lay over the barbecue pit. Throughout the event, chefs basted the meat with salt, pepper, and vinegar to add flavor and to keep it from burning. They also prepared Brunswick stew and alcoholic drinks like mint juleps. In 1913, the Dukes hosted a large barbecue at Sunnyside as part of that year's UVA alumni reunion. The photographs of this event allow us to imagine the noise, smells, and activity that would have taken place here. We see the all-day work of the chefs to cook and baste the meat while guests mingled in the woods. This group photo from the same day shows just how many people gathered in this small clearing in today's North Grounds woods. William R. Duke sits in the front row. Henry Martin is seated on the left. As UVA head janitor and rotunda bell ringer from 1868 to 1909, Martin was well known in the university community during this period, though he was often referred to by the derogatory nickname Uncle Henry. While the guests enjoyed multiple courses of barbecue, stew, and alcohol, the entertainment was typical of the Jim Crow era in Virginia and included Civil War storytelling, minstrel dancing, and performances by dialecticians. Black musicians also played at these events, and in this image, we can clearly see a string band as well as the children watching them. These barbecues took place here for half a century. They ended shortly after William R. Duke died in 1929. So we're now walking on the trail on the opposite side of Meadow Creek. We're directly down from the JAG School, and we're walking back toward the intramural fields where we started. Following the Civil War, Richard Thomas Walker Duke Sr. returned to his law practice here in Charlottesville, and he left one of his sons, William R. Duke, in charge of agricultural pursuits here at Sunnyside. Also in 1870, the Poorhouse moved to its new location in Keswick, and the Duke family purchased that property, which greatly expanded their land holdings here at Sunnyside. And farm records from the 1860s to the 1920s show us how hired laborers engaged in agriculture here at Sunnyside. We know that in 1880, according to the agricultural census, most of this land was used as farm or pasture land, and the remaining acreage, about 125 acres, remained wooded. We know that the primary crops here would have been wheat, oats, corn, also tobacco. The Dukes also raised livestock here, including pigs and cattle, and they had some horses as well. We also know that the family maintained orchards here on the property. They grew peaches, they also grew pippin apples. And in the 1870s, Richard Thomas Walker Duke Sr. co-founded the Monticello Wine Company. He served as the vice president of the company for a time. This was a local consortium of grape growers. And as part of that endeavor, the Dukes maintained a small vineyard here. They grew grape varieties that included Nortons, Concord, and many others. And that company closed in 1916 due to the temperance movement and prohibition. To accommodate the Dukes' agricultural pursuits, this landscape would have been dotted with outbuildings, stables, and animal pens. And even in the earliest aerial photo we have of this property, which is from 1937, you can see there the cleared fields around the house, and you can see some of the outbuildings that would have been up closer to the house, likely related to agriculture here, or to housing for some of the laborers that would have worked here. Black laborers did live and work on the property. Some of the laborers here included Peter Weeks, James Weeks, Wilson Carey, Morris Carey, Simpson Green, and also Caesar Young. Additionally, Mary Piper and Rosa Armstead worked here at the house as domestic servants. When William R. Duke died, he divided his estate among his wife and children. The Dukes did continue to live at Sunnyside, but they did not farm the land as heavily as William Duke had. As Charlottesville continued to develop in the 20th century, this land was not immune to racist housing policies that prohibited black homeowners from residing in this area. We know of at least one restrictive covenant that existed on the property from 1940, and it restricted anyone not of the Caucasian race from living on a part of the Duke property just north of the Sunnyside House. In the years that followed, sewer lines, power lines, the installation of the 250 bypass, which we can hear the traffic from in the background, greatly decreased the acreage of the Duke Tract property. Sunnyside remained in the Duke family until 1963, when UVA purchased the property, and shortly thereafter built the JAG Law and Business Schools, which today still form the core of this North Grounds property. And the land continues to change and evolve to meet the needs of its occupants. But there is a rich history of the people who once lived on this landscape. We're excited to share some of those stories with you today, and we're excited that so much of it is accessible to you along the Rivanna Trail. So come check it out.